The knowledge, skills, and attitudes fostered by religious literacy education contribute to developing critical thinking and empathy, and help equip learners as they engage with the religious pluralism of the world around them. There are many ways to define religious literacy, but in short, religious literacy entails learning about and learning to engage with religion as it shows up in the world around us. This might include knowing about the religious holidays celebrated in your community and avoiding scheduling events on those days. It could also include developing background knowledge to understand the religious identities of two groups who are in conflict when reporting on that situation. Or it might involve the skills to understand how religious rhetoric is being employed in political addresses. Religious literacy can be employed on the individual and personal level, such as being attentive to specific dietary needs, or the institutional, national, or global levels, recognizing the need to be attentive to religious identities and communities when engaging with any issues at these levels. The organizations and programs represented by today's speakers each approach religious literacy in their own ways, while sharing common goals of overcoming barriers of misunderstanding and promoting peaceful societies. Religious literacy is part of the work of lifelong learning, ideally beginning with teaching young students about the religious diversity around them, and then continuing throughout their formal education and then throughout their professional lives. In my own research, I've worked with primary and secondary school teachers who are engaged in professional learning about religious diversity. And it is always encouraging and joyful to hear their reflections about their learning and how their increased religious literacy will enhance their work as educators. Each of our speakers work with learners of different ages, in different professional roles, and of course in different geographic, political, and cultural settings. They will show their approaches to religious literacy, discuss practices, and hopefully inspire reflection on how religious literacy education can be expanded to other settings. We will now begin with the keynote from Dickie Sofjan.
I must say that I'm truly delighted and honored to participate in this webinar on sowing seeds of peace and ensuing fireside discussions. It is indeed significant that we hold this event for a number of reasons. Firstly, we are celebrating the International Day of Peace, and a number of countries are celebrating the Week of Peace. And as we know, promoting and celebrating peace are always a good way to sort of maintain a vibrant and healthy society. Secondly, the wars we are currently witnessing today in real time reflects partly the misunderstanding on the part of some people on religion and faith communities and what each of them signify. Sadly, some people think religion is and has always been the problem. Such knee-jerk reaction and what seemingly is a clear sign of secular myopia is largely derived from the negative effects of the politicization of religion that has contributed significantly to this troubled and conflictive world we live in today. It never occurred to them that religion could be part of the solution. Thirdly, we are witnessing an increased level of polarization and segregation in society. A high level of distrust and mistrust between and among groups in society are apparent and self-evident, undermining social cohesion and solidarity. In the meantime, the social media continues unabated to create these echo chambers that promulgate the resentment and the us and them mentality. Now, what is religious literacy? As far as I'm concerned, religious literacy is not learning or teaching religion, but rather learning and teaching about religion. There is a stark difference there. While the former is geared toward the building of a specific area of specialization or knowledge on religion or theology, the latter relates to how, Diana Ack defines religious literacy as the ability to see people through the lens of religious developments and dynamics and increase religious pluralism. With the right kind of formulations and execution, religious literacy, therefore, is expected to produce nuance and contextual understanding of religion and the awareness of the ecosystem that sustains it. In my context in Indonesia, we have trained around 1,000 religious extension officers across 10 provinces and districts and mayoralty on religious literacy, and made them see the insurmountable challenges before them. These religious extension officers are able to see what much of the challenges are also faced by other faith communities across the board. What is interesting is that these religious extension officers from the different religions have, congregations and people of faith who follow their religious teachings and or spiritual advice. In our religious literacy program, we learned that religious literacy could lower one's affective filter and mitigate the cancerous problem of hate, prejudice, and stereotyping toward the religious others. Thus, a good religious literacy should be able to lessen stress, anxiety, and this inherent distrust toward those who are different. Religious literacy programs should ideally also be a site for meaningful multi-faith engagement, where difficult conversations and interactions take place. In short, it could be argued that religious literacy could facilitate peace building, both in the formal and non-formal educational context. My team in the Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies and I currently working now with the Mennonite Central Committee, for instance, to expand our work to the next phase, where we have intentionally fixed in our religious literacy program a peace-building component to ensure that our program participants can use the knowledge, the skills, and aptitude acquired through our training to build and make peace with people from other faith groups. By extension, religious literacy could enhance empathy, increase civic participation, and help build a flourishing society. That, to me, is the most important and strategic benefit of religious literacy. With that in mind, we should have more intentional, strategic, and systematized religious literacy programs to make our society to become a kinder, gentler, and hopefully more discerning society. Thank you very much.
My background is international relations. I'm a scholar I've been looking at the relationship between religion and politics in international relations and world politics. And so one of the reasons that I started to do religious literacy was out of frustration. I was in a meeting with a bunch of diplomats where one of them, this was only a couple of years ago, one of them pronounced quite emphatically that religion was back, like as if he had discovered penicillin. And meanwhile, I've been working on this topic in religion and international politics for 20 years or so. And so I realized at that point that diplomats were so stuck in their secular ways of thinking that unless we found a way to communicate about the complexity of religion and the religious landscape in a more accessible way, we were never going to get anywhere, and we were never going to change approaches. So my focus has been very much on dealing with people from diplomacy and specifically defense. So what I'm going to take you through now is just how I approach some of these audiences. I throw up the questions that you can see on your screen now, all of which have the fundamental problem of assuming that religion is something that we can neatly see and identify, and we can determine that a conflict or a political group or something is specifically religious or it is not, when often the picture is much more complicated. It's religious and political. It's religious and ideological or social or all of these other things. But in the image that's on the screen now, you can see a kind of summary of the main attitudes that we tend to encounter in the area of religion and politics, conflict, international diplomacy, and international security. And this links back to what Dickie was talking about, where people assume that religion is the source of the problem, or they assume that it is the silver bullet that's going to solve everything. So then I pose these sorts of questions to them as well, which gets them to fundamentally question their own assumptions about what religion is. So people often have, what I understand from, or what I've seen in these audiences, is that people have very narrow definitions of what religion is. They're often informed by a Christian or Jewish worldview or a Muslim worldview, very much in like the monotheistic religions for the most part. And they ignore these other kinds of elements of it. And so by posing these questions, it really gets them thinking and realizing, oh, okay, it's actually very complicated figuring out what counts as religion and what doesn't. So what are some of the problems with these ways of approaching religion? What are some of the problems with thinking about religion? How do these contribute to issues when we do international politics and security, when organizing interventions, humanitarian interventions, for example? And also, and this I think goes back to Dickie's point again about the important role that religion can play in foreign policy, diplomacy, conflict transformation, and peace building. Most foreign ministries often think that the only relevance of religion is to the question of the right to freedom of religion or belief, and they ignore it when it comes to all other human rights and all other issues. And this is a categorical error when it comes to looking at how to build peace and inclusive and just societies in the world. So then, of course, I have to present them with a solution. I don't want to be one of these academics who just gives all the problems and doesn't give an alternative approach. And so what I do then is I take them through what I've labeled the lived religion approach. So, and this is something that I've developed based on the fact that I'm now based in a religious studies faculty. And so rather than starting with the question of religion and whether something counts as a religion or not, I get them to focus on the context, because religion means different things in different places. And this is, again, going back to what Dickie was talking about, I'm not interested in teaching people about how many Christians there are in the world or what the main dogmas of Christianity or Islam or Hinduism are, because there are about as many of those as there are people on the planet. So, but what matters is giving people the tools for how to make sense of religion in a specific context in relation to a specific conflict or a specific question or societal issue or political tension. And so this is what I take them to. The first step is the context. And that is not just about the geographic place, but it's also about the discourses and the language and the layers of politics. So if it's a development project, it's not just about what's going on the ground, but it's also about the national politics, the international donor dynamics, international political dynamics, and all of these kinds of discourses and how those are received in the country, or in the community, I should say. The next step is to what we call right-size religion, or what Peter Mandeville has termed right-sizing religion. And this is to counter the tendency that we see in diplomacy and defense to either overemphasize or underemphasize the importance of religion. Religion is present in a lot of places in relation to a lot of issues. It's connected to a lot of different aspects of society, but sometimes it will be very important and sometimes it will be less important. So this is countering that idea that religion is the cause of all the problems or the source of all the solutions. What does it do in relation to the specific issues and context? But then the third step is we have to be very specific about what we mean by this word religion. Who are we talking about? Which religions are we talking about? Which denominations or sects or divisions within that religion are we talking about? And then are we interested in actors, religious actors? Are we interested in the role of religious identities and how they construct the different parties? Or are we interested in religious narratives and how they shape the politics and the discourses that are influencing those issues? So this is a brief snapshot of some of the stuff that I do in my talks with diplomats and defense.
I sort of fell into religious literacy. My background is academic. I got my PhD in religious studies in 2017, and it was actually in the philosophy of religion, which is a very different field or subfield of religious studies. But what I became interested in was how we teach and how we teach about religion. And one of the early experiences that I had was engaging with a group of educators at Columbia where they felt very comfortable dealing with a lot of controversial, current topics, but not religion. They were comfortable engaging with issues of race and gender and violence and politics, but when it came to religion, there was this great fear, this nervousness about touching the subject, and that really got me on the path to thinking about how we teach about religion and how we can lower the barriers to educating about religion. And that is what brought me to the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understandings. We are a secular, non-sectarian, nonprofit organization that's based in New York City, and our mission is to promote justice and build respect for religious difference. I work in one of our program areas. We have several programs, but I lead our education program. And our focus is on building behaviors of respect in K through 12 age students. So in the United States, that's what we're talking around sort of ages 5 to 18. That's my area of focus. And we work with educational institutions. That includes K through 12 schools. It also includes other educational institutions, such as museums and libraries. And we work with these institutions in a number of different ways. Sometimes we'll engage directly with students, but other times we'll try to work with the entire institution to build and transform its practices and its culture to increase the attitudes of welcoming and openness towards different religious identities. We do this by sharing a number of curricular resources, and I have a little QR code with that like little dinosaur in the middle that can lead you to the page. These are all free downloads off of our website, but these are curricula for K through 12 age students on a variety of topics related to religious literacy and religious diversity education. We'll also engage with professional developments and trainings for a variety of agents within a school, not just students, but also teachers, administrators, parents. All of these groups have a role in building the culture of a school and creating the atmosphere and in which students can learn and grow. And so by engaging with all of these parties, we hope to be able to build an environment that encourages inclusivity and openness towards different religious traditions. So this background, I think, is helpful because it informs how I think about this topic of how we can promote religious literacy education as a contribution to peace. And I think a lot of the things that are, that I see as central to our approach are things that I've already heard in Dickie and Erin's approaches. And so I'm very excited to have more of a conversation about it. But to just start by saying a little bit about how we approach religious literacy education, like Dickie and Erin, we're really thinking about it in terms of skills. Our work is less focused on sort of talking about the dogmas and traditions and sub-traditions of different religious identities. We're really thinking about the skills, and particularly social and emotional skills of being able to engage with the people around you. So we're trying to prepare students and their educators to engage with people and interact with people of different religious backgrounds. And how we do that, it sort of depends on the age of the person that we're engaging with. With our youngest students, we're really trying to give them a sense of their own identity and the identities of the people around them. As we work with older groups, students in middle and high school, so getting closer to that 18 range, as well as with educators, we're preparing them to think about issues in their community and in the world as well. But we try to start it with these immediate interpersonal skills that can hopefully stand, in a variety of contexts. So this might include, for example, a conceptual understanding of religious identity, an understanding of the behaviors and the beliefs and the forms of belonging that, of which religious identity is formed, in a way that can help them understand the diversity that exists both between religious traditions and within them. We're also trying to think about communication skills and teach communication skills, helping people to ask respectful questions about each other's religious identities and to share their own religious identities and other forms of identity. Because, although ours is an identity-based approach, we want to treat religion as one aspect of a larger set of social identities that people have. And so, like Dickie and Erin have been saying, we don't want to take religion as something as too small in people's identities, but we also don't want to necessarily see it as all of people's identities. We try to treat identity as a holistic category and help people think through how the various components of who they are fit together and hang together in their lives. And so that entails also sharing skills of self-understanding, of people's own backgrounds, and how that shapes not only their sense of self, but how they engage with other people, including the biases and presuppositions that they're bringing to interactions that they have with other people. And lastly, we try to help people learn to listen to and empathize with people of other religious backgrounds. And so now, thinking about how that can be a contribution to peace, well, first of all, we're really trying to think about that very locally in the context of the school. Again, especially with our youngest learners, we're really trying to help them think through conflicts that they experience on an everyday level. And in doing that, we're really trying to help them think about how their identities, including their religious identities, are factors that can both form conflicts and transform conflicts. So I really like the things that people have been saying about how religion is not just the cause of conflict. It can be a solution, and it's not the only contributing factor to a conflict. There are others. In our work, we try to help people think about how their behaviors, beliefs, and forms of belonging impact their core values, their communication styles, and their conflict styles, to really try to understand the dynamics that are at play in a conflict situation, and also to better understand the needs of people when they're coming into conflict with them. I think one thing that we find that when we work with people who don't have conflict training, they have kind of a surface level understanding of conflict where they're engaging with specific demands that people are making or issues that they're raising, and not taking the time to really think about the needs that are underlying those positions. What is driving this conflict? What is driving people to come into conflict with each other? And so our approach tries to work with people to understand how their identity, including their religious identity, can help them verbalize and be precise about the reasons why they're entering into a conflict. And so in doing so, we hope to help people engage with conflict at a deeper level, at the level of their core values and concerns, their needs and interests, and in so doing to develop creative solutions to conflict situations. We do this by working with students and their classes, both to transform conflicts that occur in their classrooms, but also to help them think about conflicts that occur in the wider world, and give them opportunities to work with scenarios or practice skills or look at case studies that can help them understand religion as one contributing factor to conflict, and as one way in which conflicts can be transformed into positive learning experiences and growth experiences. So I'll end my presentation there. That gives a lot of sort of overview of what we do, and I'm excited for our upcoming conversation.
In the Central Republic of Africa, we work with the university to create a level of high understanding at the level of university, in the masters of management, and in the management of conflicts. One of the reasons is that in 2013, when we had a political and military crisis, we met a lot of violences. And the consequence of this crisis was really a problem with a lot of values that were non-recognized at the time. The fact that people were non-tolerant at religious level, and many problems that occurred at this level. And the religious and Christian and religious leaders and Muslim leaders just met to speak about violence and to denounce all these violence acts that were unnecessary, and their actions just favored the action for peace, and they favored also the action. What is really important is the complementarity nature of the work of three religion leaders that met in a platform where we could work with a different religion in Central Africa. They were the leaders, and they denounced all the question of awareness and the facilities in dialogue, so that the different parties could establish a dialogue today they play their role to the full extension with very positive results. And I was able to work with them in the name of KAICIID that I represent in this country and try to make them talk again in their reconciliation mission, which was not easy. So for this reason, it is important to introduce the IRD into the education system as a great opportunity, especially when it's in the context of a conflict. So especially to a higher education in a master degree to prepare students for different phases in the film. They will be also the actors and stakeholders of reconciliation and work for peace, and to be working for tolerance and living together. And the fact that tolerance, the respect of difference, and also the freedom of choice for your religion, it will be also very important for the new solution for the company. And there will be so a guarantee to live together. And at the level of the University of Bangui, which is a state university, we had in the academic year 23-24, we finished the first pilot phase with the agreement of the student who enroll in the first year. And for the 24-25 academic year, the first year students will move up to the second year. And around the month of May, June 25, we will have a new phase where students will go out in the field and do practical research with a view to defend their own work and dissertation. So that will give them the opportunity to get a diploma. So we are in a phase of this experience, and I will be very happy to share our experience at this level. And I would like to thank you so much.
My name is Karl Jaspers, and I am a master student in a program of my professor, and I am absolutely delighted to be able to participate in this newly established study, because we are in a position to contribute to conflict management. It has been installed in the law department, and it is about better understanding religion, because if you want to be able to solve conflicts, you need to understand the other side. And we also want to thank all the partners of KAICIID that gave us the opportunity to come and help us get better understanding. And we, thanks to them, accumulated knowledge, and we will use it for the betterment of society. So we are now working for promoting peace, and we are trying also to spread the word of peace and living together, and how we can avoid conflicts thanks to religious and interreligious dialogue. Now that the politics have taken up, it's sometimes difficult to do so, but we can, from a religious perspective, analyze, understand, and work together. It is an opportunity for us to have received thorough conflict management know-how and to be able to solve with inter-religious dialogue issues that have been created by people not wanting to understand the other side.
I think all of you have spoken a little bit about some of the initial misconceptions that you face, whether about what religious literacy is or what religion is. But I'm hoping that to start our conversation, you can speak a little bit more to the misunderstandings or misconceptions that you face when talking about your work to, other people whether that's potential partners, funders, participants, and how do you overcome those misconceptions to entice them to want to join in with the work?
Very often when we engage with a school district or even a teacher, there's a sort of wariness about engaging with the topic of religion because there's a presupposition that we're going to be teaching religion or helping people teach religion or adopt a particular standpoint on religion. So that could be a fear about, proselytizing in the classroom, but it could also be teaching a certain set of ideologies about religion, a certain set of stances towards religion, whether religion, for example, is a cause of conflict, right? That could be one sort of worry that people have. Now, and one of the things that we try to do is, first of all, to try to just be very clear on the difference between teaching religion and teaching about religion, on the difference between, these kinds of, either proselytizing or pushing certain positions, and trying to give people a broad understanding of the topic of religion, of a sense of the religious diversity of the United States and of the world, and skills for how to engage with that. So first of all, just making that clear can really be very helpful. And it's something we do in all of our professional development work. But I think going beyond that, it's important for us to communicate the benefits of this kind of education, both for educators and for students, to show how by getting this broad understanding of religious identity, the landscape of religion, of religious diversity, they are better equipped in all aspects of their lives, in their academic work, in the school, in a variety of professional settings that students may find themselves in, whether that's in education, in diplomacy, or elsewhere. And finally, to show that, especially for us, the kind of social and emotional skills that students are getting of communication, of empathy, of active listening, these are things that will help them in any aspect of their lives. It can help them with civic engagement, in their ethical formation, in their personal lives. So to really focus on, I think, the benefits of teaching about religion really helps in our work, working with school districts and schools.
One of the first encounters I had with someone working in defense, when I first tried to present this idea of, understanding religion in context, the response I got was, defining religion is really only something that's relevant for academics. It's not relevant for people working in policy. And the fundamental misunderstanding there is that we define what religion is all the time. We make decisions about what counts as religion and what doesn't in legal decisions, in policy development, in legislation, in project design for civil society organizations. What that conversation made me realize is that you have to, before you can start talking about understanding religion in context, you have to get people to a point of understanding that there isn't one thing called religion that you can clearly label and define and make sense of in every context around the world. What religion is different things for different people in different times and different places. But there's this very strong, pervasive idea that comes from a lot of, I think, Euro-American secular thought, at least within policy circles, within foreign ministries and defense, that religion is a thing that we park over here. It's private, it's personal, you keep it out of your work. And, there are all these different flavors, but essentially they all operate in the same way and they all do the same things. And so you have to get past that prior assumption and that prior bias before you can start getting into this, how do we actually make sense of this in our day-to-day lives and in our work? And how can we actually then use that to build better understanding, to address discrimination, insecurity, to address anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, all of these kinds of things, which I do think, and this I think goes back to Dickie's point in his keynote, this is how religious literacy contributes to peace building and building just, inclusive, and more socially cohesive societies.
Yeah, let me just jump in here. We are living in this age of conservatism and extremism. And of course, some people would tend to ask, I mean, why religious literacy again? Why religion again? Is the solution to this religious conservatism and extremism. And so, I tend to think that these people don't really understand the logic of religious literacy, because they think that we are teaching a religion. We are getting people, forcing people to learn religion, while that is obviously not the intent of religious literacy. And I've heard this from even people who are in the field of religion and peace, for instance, or international interfaith activists. And so, we need to get the message across that religious literacy is, learning and teaching about religion. So we're not trying to indoctrinate people in our own sort of ideological subjectivities, if you like, right? The other thing is that, the fact remains that, 85%, 87% of people are people of faith, people who affiliate themselves with a certain religion, or at least they believe in God and or a universal spirit, right? But as much as they or we know our own religious traditions, I mean, we hardly know anything about the religion of other people. Right. And I've seen this across Indonesia, across Southeast Asia, and many other parts of the world. Right. So they know, being a Muslim, for instance, you might know and memorize a number of the surahs or chapters of the Quran and a number of hadith, for instance, right, the prophetic sayings. But then you know nothing about Buddhism, nothing about Hinduism, Catholicism, Protestantism. You don't even know the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism, or between Hinduism and Buddhism. So that's the problem, I think, right? So there is that sort of entrenched and embedded knowledge of your own sort of religious tradition, but you have zero knowledge of the religion of other people. And I think that is one of the major problems, right? So you get this sort of sense that there is that monopoly over absolute truth, that my religion is better than yours, that, we will go to heaven and you will go to hell. So there is still that very conservative and extreme ways of thinking among the people of faith. So I think that is a fact that we cannot ignore. And we find this in virtually all of the, faith communities around the world.
If I can just add one thing to what Dickie just said, I really appreciated you bringing up the percentage of people who are of faith in the world. And if I could just take the other side of that, I think, one thing is one important issue that we're facing now, we're working on, is how to include the non-religious into the conversation about religious literacy. Because when we talk about that group that does not identify with a particular religious tradition, that is not a homogenous group at all. There's actually great diversity among people who do not affiliate with particular religious traditions. And, I'm using a couple of different terms to talk about, this group. There's not one way of defining them. Many of the people in this category believe in a deity or a higher power and pray, even though they don't identify with a particular religious tradition. Others are atheists or agnostics. And so I think the other side of what Dickie was just saying is that we also need to think about how we can create a conversation that's broad enough to include the many varieties of the non-religious as well.
And this is a problem across the board, because what we see particularly in freedom of religion or belief campaigning, is that often the non-religious, the atheists, people of no belief get forgotten. And so this question around thought, belief, the human right is freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So we need to make sure that all of those flavors are encompassed in. And so that means that religious literacy or philosophical literacy or belief literacy isn't just for people outside of religion, it's also necessary within religion as well.
I'll take a shot at this one because we do have a sort of structural problem in Indonesia, and that is that our religion subject in schools up until universities is very mono-religious, you see. And so if you're a Muslim, then you get to learn only about Islam from kindergarten, primary school, secondary school, high school, and university. And obviously that in itself creates that sort of monocultural, mono-religious, mono-linguistic sort of way of thinking and development of the worldview, you see. And again, I'd like to reiterate the problem whereby, one might know his or her own religious tradition, but have zero knowledge of the religious traditions of others. So there is that structural problem, but there's also this sort of underlying philosophical assumptions about education, right? About, what is it that we want to teach our children? I mean, what is the function of education, basically, in relation to faith traditions, in relation to our worldviews? Do we want them to become pious people? Do we want them to become ultimately, good people who follow the, religious traditions? Or do we want them to have this wider view of religion and accept and appreciate and celebrate the sort of religious diversity that is, within our society? So I think we need to sort of double check on these sort of educational philosophical assumptions about what our society want our students to be at a later sort of juncture in their lives, and when they actually come into society and see and interact with other people in society.
I very much appreciate that answer, and I would say that in the American context, one of the biggest difficulties that we have is just how decentralized education, K through 12 education, is in the United States. Every county, sometimes every town, has its own school district with its own set of priorities, and it can be very difficult to engage in different communities, in different states, in different cities. Sometimes a lot of our work is focused in New York City. Going outside of that, you have to learn a whole set of different rules, of different standards, of different practices of educational institutions. And, it takes a lot of time and effort to be able to do that and to be able to engage deeply with educational institutions. So that's one sort of just general baseline difficulty that I think exists. Another thing that, that I see a lot in our work is that I would like for educational institutions to engage with the topic of religion proactively, so that, oftentimes what happens is we'll get a call when something happens. Some conflict occurs either in a classroom, in a school, or in the world, and it's already reached the point where some negative impact or event has occurred in the school as a result of that. There's been an incident of bullying, of conflict, sometimes even of violence, and that is the point in which, when we're called, when the situation has already gotten very bad. And of course, some of that's inevitable. That's just inevitable in our line of work. But I would really, love to be able to communicate the need for a more proactive stance towards engaging the topic of religion, so that when something does occur, schools aren't prepared for it and able to engage with it productively. And just to add one third thing based on what Vicky was saying, is that I think it would really help for those of us who are engaged in religious literacy advocacy to be explicit about our normative commitments. What do we think we want students to get out of religious literacy education, and how do we think it can help them in their adult lives?
I think one of the things that Daniel is pointing to is the rationale. Like, how do you have to have a rationale for why you engage in religious literacy. And that's been my experience with foreign ministries, and when addressing defense forces, their first question is, what's the added value of this? So, I mean, that previously that was the question, like, what is the added value of religion? Which assumes that the underlying assumption is that a secular way of approaching the world is the most effective, or is the best. So what is the added value of religion? And then this question of what is the added value of engaging in religious literacy? And so I think that often what you see is that there's been some kind of problem. As Daniel mentioned, there's been some kind of challenge, and people are kind of starting to see, oh, actually, maybe we should know more about this thing called religion. And that is a big part of why defense forces have started to be more interested in this topic. There were failings in Afghanistan and Iraq, a lot of which was attributable to a lack of religious literacy in context, and also within foreign ministries. Added to that, so a couple of the challenges is, how do you get access to these institutions? So foreign ministries, defense forces tend to be very closed. So how you have to gain, it's a question of privilege and access in terms of being able to sort of tell people how helpful having a religious literacy can be. The other problem with that is simply time. Like, you get a very limited amount of time to tell people how you can't go into lots of detail. So it's taken me a long time to kind of refine the way that I share this information down to something that is accessible and deliverable within the short amount of time that you get in these kinds of situations. Another problem is the frequent rotations that people are on within foreign ministries. You sort of have one person in a position for 3 or 4 years, and then they move on and sort of back to square one. And then it's about trying to get input or more training brought in at sort of the entry level through diplomatic academies. But the other part of all of this, which sits a bit, I'm still kind of working my way through, is the sense of complicity that can develop out of that. Because so in the sense that, part of what I'm trying to do in helping people to have the tools to understand religion better in context is for minds to avoid making some of these, in some cases, life-destroying mistakes that have been made in the past. But, ultimately, foreign policy and defense are driven by state interests. So the goal is to achieve the interests of your state. So a question that I have in all of this, I provide this religious literacy training and give people the tools to understand how to make sense of religion. To what extent am I then enabling simply a different kind of manipulation or a way of taking advantage of people for the self-interests of the state? And I don't have an answer for that yet. It's something that I'm trying to reflect on. But yeah, to what extent do I become complicit just in a different kind of state power in doing this kind of activity? Yeah, I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, can I just jump in on that? Because we have trained diplomats before, both Indonesian diplomats as well as diplomats who are assigned to Jakarta or any other sort of relations with Indonesia. And as you know, Indonesia does sort of use Indonesian Islam and religious diversity as sort of the soft power projection, right? But it's quite glaring to see that, many of the diplomats, at least the generation of my brothers and my fathers, they tend to be more sort of attuned to the sort of secular worldviews, yeah. And so they do not come from the sort of Islamic traditional schools or santrans or the theological seminaries and whatnot. So they do have a certain sort of bias against sort of religious traditions, which is rather counterintuitive for a country like Indonesia. But, when we spoke with the sort of education and training of the Ministry of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they were sort of really open arms about it. And they said, we want all of our diplomats to have your training, Patiki, and because we feel like there is that sort of gap that needs to be filled. And it's interesting that we found that many of the ambassadors and even deputy chiefs of missions or minister counselors who cannot speak of religious diversity in their own country, which to me is quite ironic, for a country like Indonesia, which is considered by the Pew Survey Research as one of the most religious countries in the world. The other thing is, just responding to what Daniel was saying earlier. I mean, in the state of Texas, the Bible is considered as literature. Right. And so there is that other side of the equation where the state sort of imposes a certain sort of religious worldview on students. Right. And by considering it as part of literature studies, then the Bible seeps in, or Christianity seeps in as sort of the predominant religious tradition and worldview that is imposed on students who, otherwise might not be a Protestant or Christian for that matter. And so you find that kind of sort of complexity in a country like the US, where, the autonomy of the states might impose something that might necessarily in tune with the idea of religious literacy in itself.
The Central African Republic is a particularly polarized conflict, and fear, polarization are often a response that a human gives to something that doesn't know. Ignorance is what brings us to fear. It was what brings us to polarization. This is why the message from Boris is a very simple one, but I think always deep. Through the teaching of religion, of other religious traditions, this applies to believers or non-believers that might have prejudices on religion. Learning about something is what opens in me the possibility of tolerating it, accepting it, and understanding it. And it is extremely important in societies. We think maybe of more Western societies where is a problem, yes, but it's not maybe a cause for major polarization of ghettization or complete division of communities as we see in other contexts. And this in many contexts allows exactly for tolerance, allow for people to reopen a dialogue. Whereas if I will never learn about religion, if I'm a non-believer, or the other religion, in particular, if I grew up in a context that demonized the other religion, the space for tolerance will never open. Knowledge leads us to understanding, leads us to tolerance. Ignorance, unluckily, always keeps people in their position. And this is, I think, an important message coming from contexts where conflicts have been exacerbated by polarization and intolerance. Thank you.
Hey, can I add a quick thought to that? Just as Pietro was sharing what Boris and Carl, thank you, what Boris and Carl brought in. So I don't like to talk about the theology of different religious traditions. Boris's point is absolutely spot on. For me, I'm not a theologian, and that's not my qualifications. And I think in Western contexts, European and American contexts in particular, it can be quite, just to bring that counter perspective, it really is, there's a danger, and you see it within foreign ministries and sometimes within political leaders' statements. They will talk about true Christianity or true Islam. And the minute they do that, it is a theological act. They are intervening in the theology of a particular religious tradition, and that is not their job. It is not our job as a secular educator, as policymaker, as someone from a civil society organization. It is not our job to say what counts as true or real or right religion or not. And this is a question, these are all questions for people internally within their own religious traditions to deal with, but the point still stands that exposure to different religious traditions and different religious communities, and understanding that there are these different beliefs out there, like it's building the relationships and building the trust and overcoming that ignorance that Boris talked about, that is so crucial. But I do think it's an important thing to flag that it is not our job to say what is right and what is wrong when it comes to different religious traditions.
There are both challenges and opportunities for incorporating religious literacy education into formal education. Is first of all, the curriculum. And in doing so, one thing I think that we can think about, and there's research being done on this right now, particularly in the United States, there are state standards for what is taught about religion and how that can be incorporated in classes. And that actually relates to the point that Tiki was making about, Texas and the Bible curriculum, and there are other ones like it in Louisiana and Oklahoma and South Dakota. These, attempts that are coming in to, bring more proselytization, into education about religion. And I think one of the things that we need to do as religious literacy advocates is make the case for why religious literacy education is important for students, and ultimately why it is a superior form of education for students. So that takes us to some of the points that, Boris and Carl and Erin were just making. It's a very difficult case to make a lot of the time. There's oftentimes a lot of resistance to it, and the people who are pushing for these curricula, these sort of Bible curricula, are often very strong and well funded. So it could be a very difficult job to do, but I think that we have to do it. We have to make that kind of case. Relatedly, I think another important area where there's a lot of opportunity is in teacher education and teacher training, to incorporate religious literacy, education into the certification requirements for teachers who are going into education, to have some baseline understanding of the skills of interacting and engaging across religious difference.
If I may build a bit on what Daniel mentioned, as Boris mentioned at the beginning, KAICIID is indeed supporting the inclusion of interreligious dialogue and religious literacy into formal education, the formal education curricula of the University of Bangui. But this question, if I recall properly, had a second bit that was kind of interesting and a bit challenging probably for us, is that how you keep this teaching then a lifelong, how you keep this education on religion, something that the person keeps on practice. Now, obviously the duration of this continuation can vary, but for example, what is happening in Bangui at the moment for us is passing from learning religion to practice, also to try, since the master program is focused on interreligious dialogue and religious education for peace, people that graduate from this religion on the basis of the various religious traditions and various examples of peace building that you can get from these traditions, they form directly, let's say, a think tank, let's say a center for practicing the values of religion and spreading the message. I think that slowly, by pushing people to open up their religious practices, this can become part of their lifelong learning, let's say, not limit to the teaching of a religion, but try to do the next steps, to bring what people learn, to push the people to bring what they've learned about religions to their communities, to their societies, if the education on religion has the purpose of peace directly.
One of the projects that I'm currently doing in terms of our research, we're looking at the right to freedom of religion or belief in cross-cultural contexts, and working with a project funded by the Dutch Foreign Ministry called the Joint Initiative for Strategic Religious Action. And what we have been finding there is, like, a lot of the work that the communities are doing involved in this is religious literacy work. They're bringing communities together to learn more about each other's different religious traditions. And so I think, like, involving local actors, supporting the work of local actors on the ground in these different communities. So people like Boris, people like Dicky and their networks, that is crucial. And they need to be the people who take the lead on this, because they're the ones who understand the context, they understand the challenges. So yeah, basically giving it to the experts and letting them take the lead on that question around religious literacy at the grassroots, with people who are not literate and don't have access to good internet or webinars or whatever. The other thing is to invest in formal education. I mean, that's beyond the scope of what a lot of people in this webinar are doing, but to actually advocate for our governments to invest in just good education that trains people not just in religious literacy, but in critical thinking skills, in the ability to be literate in all sorts of things, and to give them the tools to make sense of their own environments, to test information that they're given, and to make sure that what they're hearing and what they're getting is from good sources. And then on the question of the lifelong learning, I think part of that is also, when we do initial religious literacy work, is to make clear to people that religion, belief, whatever you want to talk about, it's not static. These religious traditions that we engage with, they change over time. Our own beliefs and philosophies change over time. So, and that is the reason why we need to keep continually checking in with this, keep following what's happening and learning about, I mean, AI is rapidly changing the way different communities practice and engage with their religions. So this is why lifelong learning matters so much when it comes to any kind of literacy, but also because this is what we're talking about here, religious literacy as well.
Yeah, on the question of lifelong learning, I've always seen religious literacy as sort of a life-changing experiential learning. And so I think there is that opportunity for us to sort of be more creative and innovative in the way we sort of devise the curriculum for our own sort of religious literacy programs. The one I'm developing right now with the Mennonite Central Committee and the various church groups in Indonesia as well is this idea on how we can infuse more of the discussion on human dignity, for instance, because human dignity can be used as sort of a common denominator when we talk about life experiences and about the different faith groups and non-faith groups living side by side and coexistence and so on and so forth. So there are many ways in which we ourselves can sort of create and recreate the curriculum for religious literacy to whomever, groups we are targeting, including students. Of course, we've sort of, in the Indonesian context, we've sort of tried hard to make policy briefs as well to the president and to the relevant line ministries, for instance, to say that religion subjects should be more multi-religious than mono-religious. And this has been one of the sort of requirements of our Reformation movement and democratization commitments in the country. But yet, it's an uphill battle. But I think there are these openings and opportunities in which we need to work together and collaborate on, for future work.
I'll start here. I think it would be great for religious literacy educators and advocates to share more success stories, moments where a student or a classroom was really transformed through religious literacy education. So I can give one example. We work with a teacher in our advisory board named Cheryl. She works in Queens, New York City. And during the COVID year, so this is 2020 to 2021, when there was a lot of disruption to education and classrooms were remote and people didn't have a good sense of community, students felt very isolated. And when they came back, they really needed to reestablish their ability to communicate and engage with each other. And by doing religious literacy work with Cheryl and her class, we were able to build a really positive culture in that classroom. And one of her students actually left her a note, an anonymous note saying that, I feel more safe in your classroom than I feel anywhere else. And that was because of the work that Cheryl had done, helping people share their identities and become more open to other people's identities. It created this environment where this student felt safe and heard and respected. And it's, I think that it's a small moment, but a significant one.
Those are the moments that keep us going when, the headlines are tough. Other examples for positive impacts?
So just a couple from my own experience. One is that I've had more requests to speak on the topic of religion in relation to diplomacy and security this year than I've had in the past 10 years. So there is clearly an appetite for how to make sense of and understand this topic better, which is encouraging. The other one that I'll just share is it really impacted me. I was doing so I do these talks for NATO Defence College every 6 months, and I'd done one of these talks, and this was, I think, last year or the year before, and I was sitting and talking with a small group, and one of the members of the group was a Danish colonel who had served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and he asked me my thoughts on having a religion advisor for NATO, and I gave all the usual caveats of, well, you can't just you need someone who, it can't be someone who's a specialist on a single religion or a single place, because you've got all of these, it's very difficult because you've got all of these different places and all the rest of it. And then he just paused, and then he looked at me and he said, I just feel that if we'd had the kind of framework that you gave us today when we went into these places, we just wouldn't have made the mistakes that we did. And that was very humbling. And it was very sobering to just realize the kind of impact that this can have. Very encouraging as well, but yeah, so.
Yeah, just to add on, I think I'm very confident and optimistic about the future of religious literacy. I think there is definitely a need for that around the world. What I've done with my program is to also include a training of trainers. And so we can really get religious extension officers to become, trainers for these religious literacy programs. So, I mean, we can't be everywhere every time, right? So by having these training of trainers, we get them to become like us and to be able to deliver the kinds of religious literacy training that they've undergone, And so we've had feedback on that. Some of our religious extension officers would come back to us and said, Padiki, we've done this in such and such provinces and districts, and it went very well. We had like 20 participants, 30 participants attending my religious literacy program, and so on and so forth. So these kinds of stories, I think, coming from the regions and the various districts around Indonesia have really sort of made me much more confident in the way our approach is in terms of infusing that training of trainers. Of course, we have modules that we can provide to them, and we have even guidelines and so on and so forth to the minute, in terms of how to get religious literacy training going in their own sort of respective communities.
If I may come in with a final comment from Joseph and Boris, that as we mentioned, they are our experts on the field. They are the one that realize these successes. Boris reiterates what the intervention he made before, like giving a chance to tolerance, giving an opportunity for people to learn tolerance is a major success in many contexts. And this is reinforced by what Carl just messaged me, is that this helps young people, students, gives them equipments, and in particular gives them connections. When KAICIID focuses on the teaching of interreligious, not only one denominational, but it always includes the teaching of interreligious dynamics and the various religions. And this allows for exchanges, for meetings, for encounters between students that in many cases were not possible in a context that is extremely polarized and where education is sometimes focusing on on a single religion. So it's targeting their own believers, while an interreligious education message automatically brings together students and helps them in overcoming the challenges they faced their whole lives.
I just like to say that religious literacy, ideally, again, to reiterate what I had said, that it should be a site for multi-faith engagement, where difficult conversations and interactions between and among members of the faith communities converge and really be facilitated. Thank you.
I'm very inspired and excited to learn more about the different frameworks that people are bringing in to teach religious literacy as a set of skills. I think that's a really important shift in our thinking, a really positive shift in our thinking. And I appreciate the ability to have this conversation today to learn more about, how other people are doing it. And there are a lot of things that we can learn from. So thank you.
I'm struggling a little to think of one sentence or even one word, really, because it's been so rich. But maybe just to follow up on Daniel, what Daniel was saying, there's always more for us to learn. There's always ways for us to improve, and there's always opportunities to share and to build tolerance and understanding. And that's a reason for us to have hope.
Yeah, exactly. If I would have to choose one single word, would be exactly learn. That is the message. Try to learn, in particular, the thing that you see that is more distant from you, not just things that you have in your circle. This will make your life better, not only because you'll know more things, but also because you'll be able to talk and live with the others for real, and not each in his own position.
I think, as we've seen, religious literacy is a very diverse, complex concept, and it's really, as Pietro said, it's about learning, and it's an ongoing process. So we thank you for contributing to this learning, and we hope that we can continue our conversations together in the days and years to come.